So on your question, Jonathan, which is very valuable, here's the thing. Which is the variable that in your case is causing an externality? I'm asking.
I'm guessing it would be the carbon emissions, right?
Exactly. So let's start from there. So carbon emissions, let's say from power plants or cars or industries or any other source, and give me a second, Max, and I will give you the microphone next. Those carbon emissions are associated with two major elements in our analysis. Those carbon emissions are associated, on the one hand, on a particular activity of someone who is profiting from that activity. And by that, I don't mean that by emitting carbon, CO2 into the atmosphere, you make money. You make money because you produce something, and as a byproduct of that production, you create that externality, right? So that said, those carbon emissions are associated with a variable that is related to an activity that is profitable for some people. And the second dimension is that those carbon emissions are harming a particular group of the society. And depending on what's the scale or the scope of what you're trading, analyzing, then the curves that you are going to be drawing in your diagram are going to be related to the external marginal costs to those people who are being harmed by those emissions and are not profiting from the economic activity that produces the emissions, right?
Right. Okay.
So that's the first baseline framework that all of you should be thinking about. And you are expected, as I put in the guide, and I am going to clarify that for everyone because a couple of people have wrote to me, or the ones who showed up yesterday for us office hours. Yes, you need to draw a similar diagram, like the diagram that you learned about the banana production and the weevil kill and the pesticide use that harm these fishers downstream. Think of the equivalent diagram, and yes, you need to draw the diagram. If you want to do it in paper by hand and then take a picture with your phone and insert the picture in the paper, that's fine. As long as I see how you are drawing the key curves, and the key curves are the marginal private costs of producing that something. And now, Jonathan, you should be thinking, what is it that these entities are producing that are creating the emissions? But what is it? Is it steel? I am going to talk about a particular example of steel that is fascinating today. Is it cars? Is it energy? Whatever that is being produced is going to be in that horizontal axis. And that horizontal axis in that level of production, remember the example of bananas, you will find your own examples, will imply marginal private costs to the producer, which will imply profits for that producer. But there's going to be also a curve of marginal external costs. In the case of the fishers, remember those marginal external costs where the income losses, the fishing depletion, the mortality of the fish, the sickness of the people that are reflected in that marginal external cost curve. And if you add up vertically, stacking up the marginal external cost and the marginal private cost, you end up with the marginal social cost. Right. Social meaning the cost for all society. So you need to find out which are those variables in your case and then build that basic model. And finally, because your point is very interesting, Jonathan, which is the carbon tax. So why this that I just described is interesting for a carbon tax? Well, a carbon tax is going to affect some of those curves, right? So I'm asking you, Jonathan, how would a carbon tax affect any of those curves that we just mentioned? Do you see a particular curve that would be affected by a carbon tax?
So I think that obviously it would add to the private costs.
Exactly. Because now the private ones will have to pay up that cost. And the more they produce, the more they emit. And the more they emit, the more carbon tax they're going to pay. And this is going to be in their private costs. And therefore, your optimal solution in that situation is going to change whether you have or not the carbon tax. And that would be a very interesting analysis in your essay. What would the picture look like without the tax and with the tax? You see what I mean?
Yep.
And that would be really interesting for you to see with the graphical model that we've been doing, what would a carbon tax do to that? And in fact, if you go back to the text or any environmental economics text, and if you go to Pigouvian taxes, that's exactly the purpose of a Pigouvian tax. And you read about Pigou, Arthur Pigou, and why Pigouvian taxes are exactly pursuing that idea to internalize the external costs into the private costs of the entity, in this case, a company or whatever it is that is creating the externality. So that's a perfect setting for putting all these things together. Okay.
Yep.
So thank you, Jonathan, because that's a great question for a very good example to go through your challenge now with putting all these things together. So I'm going to give the word to Max, who has his hand raised, and then I will go to Catherine, who is writing there. So Max, go ahead.
Yeah, let's not do that. Let's actually.
So I had a question about the length of the paper, and also my question is the same as Catherine. Can you show us how to make the graph?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's very similar to what you have been doing. So let me use here the whiteboard. And what I've been trying to, let's see if I can move my keyboard away from here and put this thing here, and let's see if this should work. Give me a second here. So let me see. Hold a second. Should I put this here? If I do the whiteboard, which is here, I need to move it here. Okay, I think this is the whiteboard here. So you're still seeing the whiteboard, right? Are you seeing it in the screen?
Yes, I see it.
Okay, so I'm going to first think in general. This is the production function Q of whatever you are producing. So in your case, Max, what is the economic activity that you are associating with an externality?
I'm using fracking.
Okay.
So like ground instability is like a good example of one.
Right. Okay. So ground stability is your concern that fracking will create more potential harm to certain people because of the instability, geologically speaking, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, correct. So what is it? So who is interested in fracking? Give me an example, a fictitious example. Who is interested in doing fracking?
Oil companies that are trying
Exactly.
to increase production.
So that oil company is interested in increasing production of what exactly?
Oil.
Yeah, exactly. And in fracking, it could be gas too, but let's talk about oil. So it could be oil, right? And that oil is represented sometimes in barrels, right?
Yeah, typically.
Now, I am going to ask Catherine too. Catherine, in your case, which is the economic activity that you are dealing with?
So I'm dealing with switching from like fossil fuels like oil, coal, etc. to like green energy, like renewable stuff.
Okay, but what is it that is being produced? Energy and
in that case, yeah, energy would be being produced.
Right. And notice it's interesting, oil is related to energy, but in your case, you're thinking about energy produced because the producer of that energy profits from producing and selling that energy, right? And the energy producer could be a power plant, right? An energy company, okay? So it could be energy and it could be, let's say, in kilowatts, right? That's a very common measure. And Notice in both cases from Max's and Catherine's, in both cases, if this company produces more oil or produces more kilowatts, it sells more if it sells it at the market at a particular price, right? Okay, so if you are producing below price in terms of costs, you're making a profit. And you will stop producing oil or kilowatts at the point in which producing that extra unit is more costly than what you get marginally from that last unit in the market, which is the price. Okay, so we are going to be needing a price. And now I forget, how is it that you change colors? I think it's here. So let me move this here and I can just draw. And how is it the colors? Now I forgot to do the colors here. Let me see, where are the colors here?
Professor,
Yes.
we're not seeing anything on the screen.
No.
I'm not
Okay.
sure if that's on purpose or not.
Hold it. Yeah, thank you. But you were seeing before, right? The
We
graph.
saw the whiteboard. We just didn't see anything being written on
Oh,
the
really?
whiteboard.
Oh shit. Wait. Ah. What happened? I thought I was doing that. How about now? Do you see the whiteboard with the
Yes,
two
much
axes?
better.
Okay. So what I'm trying to do here is, let's see if this works. I'm going to think for now that this is the price that this company is facing for that particular production of whatever it is. And we have here two examples: producing barrels of oil or producing kilowatts of energy. Okay. And think that now I'm going to use this with a blue color, for example. Think that I'm going to say that this is the marginal private cost for this company. Okay. So let's say, for example, at this particular level, you're still seeing the graph, right?
Wow.
You're still seeing the graph? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So notice, at that level of production, let's call that Q1, this company is interested in producing that amount of oil, those number of barrels, or those kilowatts of energy. Why? Because at the margin, at that last unit, that company is making a profit, and that profit is this difference at that last margin, meaning that the cost with the blue line, which is the marginal private cost, is below the market price, which is the marginal revenue for the company, and therefore the company is interested in producing Q1. Is the company interested in producing more than Q1? What do you think? Yes or no? Thomas is saying yes with his head. Why, Thomas, do you think is a yes?
Because they'd make more profit.
Exactly. I mean, think of this point. At this point, Q2, still the company is making a profit. So it should keep going more than Q2. How far? Up to the point that we're going to call this Q asterisk private. At that Q asterisk private, the company maximizes profit. So if it is Catherine's example of a power plant that is producing kilowatts of energy, whatever the power plant is producing that, either by burning coal or connecting a grid of solar panels, this power company is going to produce all the way up to Q asterisks in the graph of kilowatts of energy. But in Max's example, this producer, this oil company, is interested in producing Q asterisks private of barrels of oil to maximize its profits. So far, so good. That is the solution of the market. That's the point exactly where you converged in the first rounds, in the first day of class in an experiment in the supply and demand of cars. So each of you were watching your marginal costs and you decided to sell or not a particular number of cars because you were trying to cover your costs. But if the price in the market wasn't as good, you were not going to sell your car at a loss. Good? That was at the market level. This is at the company level that we're watching here. But if you aggregate all these companies, this is going to be, this Q asterisk is going to be the aggregation, the total number of units of that product, namely oil barrels or kilowatts of energy that maximizes the profit for the company. But we haven't talked anything about external costs yet. But this that I just did, all of you should do for your particular problem. Think of your particular situation. Some of you are thinking about energy, but others are thinking about deforestation. And in the Padlet, we have been commenting there that this horizontal axis, and I'm going to add that one if you want. So we are going back with green. It could be cattle. Imagine that you are interested in selling cattle, that you are raising in pasture land after you cleared forest, okay? So this could be number of heads, okay? So cattle ranchers are going to, whoops, sorry, let's see if I can erase that. No, oh boy, Dios, wait. Let me erase all this garbage here, okay? So it could be also number of heads of cattle that you're raising and you're feeding in those pasture lands, okay? So far, this is the private part of the story. Now let's go to the external part of the story. So it happens that this production of oil, because of this fracking, produces instability in the ground, which is Max's concern. So in some states in the United States, people are beginning to get worried that there is some seismic activity, and this could create instability in the ground, and this could create costs to people. And Max is going to find out and research on why exactly is the instability in the ground, geologically speaking, is going to cost people. And it could cost in various dimensions because of construction, buildings, infrastructure, roads, dams, things that could get damaged because of the increased activity, geological activity, because of the fracking. That is going to cost someone something and is not currently paid by the frackers because the frackers are only paying their blue line here. In the case of the kilowatts of energy that Catherine is interested in, these kilowatts of energy are associated with emissions of CO2 to the atmosphere, and that emissions of CO2 to the atmosphere are creating cost to someone else. And we have mentioned lots of examples already in the course about that. And we already talked about climate change and the costs of climate change as one example in which all these costs are harming someone else, different from the energy producer. In the case of cattle, we have mentioned some of these too. The more heads are associated with more land deforested, and the less forest land we have, more externalities to other people because of the loss of biodiversity, because of climate regulation, because of carbon sequestration in the ground, all these kind of effects for others. So how do we account for that? So let's say, and I'm going to use yet one more color, and let's see if I can use this brown here. Let's say that, whoops, what happened here? Draw and brown. Let's see if that works out. No, why is still the eraser? I don't want the eraser. Okay, here. Okay, got it. So let's think that these costs are these particular costs here. And this would be the marginal external costs. So what I'm trying to say there is that at Q1, let me use here the pointer, at Q1 here, this distance here between Q1 all the way up to the brown line are at the margin for that level of production of Q, whatever your preferred unit is. That's the cost to society of those levels of production at Q1. But if you increase your production to Q2, those external costs are a bit larger. And if you go to Q asterisk, those costs at the margin are going to be even larger. Now I'm going to add up both curves, and I am going to build a final curve, and I'm going to put it in orange. Let's see if it works with orange. Yes. And I'm going to add up these two graphs vertically, the brown and the blue one. So that means that probably around here we're going to start, and this is going to go somewhere like this, and this would be the marginal, marginal social cost. Let me do that again because it's not very clear here. So I'm going to write it again, and I'm going to go here with marginal social cost. In other words, the orange line adds both the private and the external costs to society. And what that is saying is that if society, not the private company who is interested in this activity, the fracker, the cattle rancher, or the energy producer, but society is better off at Q2 and not at Q asterisk. Because at Q asterisk, society is assuming too much of a large social cost because of the pollution and the externalities created by this. And in this case, society would be better off at this point, in which price is equal to marginal social cost. And now I have completed the entire graph and the entire framework. You just need to mention exactly what is your units in the horizontal axis and why that production of that particular unit of production that you're analyzing creates the externalities represented in the brown line. Why is that production associated with the private costs, which is the blue line? And therefore, when you add up both the blue and the brown lines, curves, you end up with the marginal social cost, and therefore why we have a difference between the private optimal, which is Q asterisk, and the social optimum, which in this case it would be Q2. After that, you can do many interesting things that I already mentioned, for example, with Jonathan. He was saying, what would happen if I impose a carbon tax? Well, the carbon tax is going to shift the blue line all the way up to become the orange line. So if you design the carbon tax to account for all the marginal external costs, Jonathan, your carbon tax should make the new blue line be equivalent to the orange curve, right? Now, Catherine is asking another question. She's saying, I want to analyze what happens when a company switches from non-clean energy production, so fossil fuel-based energy production, towards cleaner production. That means that the blue line here of the marginal private cost may or may not change depending on which technologies you're comparing. And in fact, in chapter 20, this is for Catherine in particular, there's a lot of data. You can see there are a lot of data on the different technologies for producing energy because of the mention to abatement strategies, abatement policies to reduce the carbon emissions from a particular technology. So it might be the case, Catherine, that blue line is different for clean energy than for dirty energy or fossil fuel based energy. That's one part, Catherine. But the other part in your case is that the Brown curve, the marginal external cost, it's most likely different for clean energy production than for fossil fuel based energy production, right? And that brings me to the last point that Catherine wrote in the chat, which is, are we using real life data or just theoretical data? It's like a hybrid of both. So what I am inviting you is to create these curves with the most accessible data that you have. But what I'm trying to say, Catherine, is it has to be realistic in the sense that probably the Brown curve in the diagram that you're watching, the Brown curve, is probably below the Brown curve for, let's call it brown energy or energy based on fossil fuels, because the marginal external cost of producing energy based on renewables like solar or wind energy probably generates less external costs than the case for fossil fuel based energy, right? So this basic model has lots of applications for your essays. And again, just basically go to your own notes, check in the Padlet what I have written for the cases of you guys who have decided to put some information there so that I can react, and just build this graph, because I expect you all to build your particular graph for your particular problem and justify why you draw the curves that way. Okay? So I hope with this I have covered a lot of the question, but this is good because this is a way to review what we have seen in the past. And to me, the most important thing is that you put this together for your essay with a clear message of how I use this analysis that I have been going through in the course to put it in this particular topic that I'm interested in. Okay, so I hope that with that I have answered the questions of Catherine, Max, Jonathan, and many others.
Sorry, I just have one more question. When you said, so for the second graph for me, you know, if there's a carbon tax, the private cost would go up and it would become the marginal social cost. But then what happens
if the tax is well designed?
Yes. But then what happens to the marginal social cost? Because I don't imagine that it would go up, right?
No, it becomes the same
It just
marginal.
becomes the same.
Yeah. So with that question, Jonathan, if you remember the situation of the banana producers and the fishers, and I was telling you hypothetical situations, one of which was, imagine that the fishers are so fed up with seeing the mortality in the fish in the lake, and they are exhausted of getting sick. But at the same time, they recognize that the banana production is profitable and it's a good business. The fishers cooperative goes to the banana producer and says, we are going to buy you up, or let's do a merger, or let's build this one single company that combines both the banana and the fish. So now the company owns the land for banana production and the lake for fishing. And
Right.
then that company just did exactly what you were wondering, Jonathan, which is they internalized external costs. And now for that company, that new company, the marginal social cost became the same marginal private cost, because they internalize into their own costs the externalities that they were suffering before. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Thank you
Any
so
other
much.
question on this? I'm going to lower your hand, Max, assuming that I answer your question, unless you still have a question. Good, okay. Would it help if I save this graph that I downloaded here, that I draw here, and share it with you? Yeah, okay, Thomas says yes, nobody says anything else. So following Thomas' request, I'm going to save this as PNG. How do I save that? PNG. And now showing folder. Where is the folder? Good. Here it is. Is it? Let's see. Yes, whiteboard. There it is. Okay. So I will send this graph. I will upload it in the Moodle once we're done. Great. Any other question? Okay, now let me go to my, wait. Now let me go to stop sharing here. Now let me share my notes here. Good, okay, good. So what I want to do today, first is couple elements of housekeeping, one of which we already did, which is clarifying some things on the essay 2. If you are still interested at the last moment, and I hope not before you start your essay, I will be having some more office hours tomorrow at 5:30, from 5:30 to 6:30, in case you want to use that time to check with me, and we can go over your questions. The second one is, let me quickly do the following poll, and this poll is going to be anonymous. And basically what I want to ask you is, how much do you agree with the following statement? And the reason I'm doing it anonymous is because really I want your complete honesty on how you're feeling this against what happened in essay 1. So be as sincere as you can be.